Ryan, if you can unmute.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Hass. I am the director of the Brookings China Center, and I'm honored to be co-leading today's event with David Wessel from the Brookings Hutchins Center. And today's event is on China's slowing economy and its implications for the world. It's widely recognized that China's economy is facing challenges: a slowing property sector, sluggish consumer spending, heavy debt loads, and an aging society, just to name a few examples. And with President Trump's return to office in the coming months, trade tensions between the United States and China are certainly going to sharpen. So what does this all tell us, and what does it portend for China's future economic trajectory? And how will China's economic performance impact global growth? We are fortunate to have an all-star panel to help us think through these questions. We have experts on China's macroeconomy, China's political economy, trade issues, as well as how China uses its economic power to advance its global objectives. I'm going to be inconsiderately brief in introducing each of our speakers, and then I will turn the floor over to our moderator, Bob Davis. Wendy Cutler is the Vice President and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute and Managing Director of its office in Washington, D.C. Wendy spent 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator with the United States Trade Representative's Office, where she also served as acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Jon Czin is the Michael Armacost Chair in Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings. Prior to joining Brookings, Jon was a senior analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency and also a director for China at the White House National Security Council. Eswar Prasad is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is also the Talani Senior Professor of Trade Policy and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. Eswar previously had a distinguished career at the International Monetary Fund, where he headed the China division, among other roles. And last, but certainly not least, is Zoe Liu, who is the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Zoe also is author, most recently, of the book Sovereign Funds: How the Communist Party of China Finances its Global Ambitions. And last, we are fortunate to have the legendary journalist Bob Davis leading our conversation today. Bob is known for many things, one of which is his co-authoring of a book, Superpower Showdown, which provided the inside story of the U.S.-China trade war during the President Trump's first administration. And it will be required reading for everyone who's going to be following the period to come. So with that, let me turn it over to Bob to take the conversation away.
Let's do that. Here we go. Start again. Well, thanks so much, Ryan. That's a very nice introduction. Legendary is a very nice term for old. I've been doing this a long time. We're gonna drill down on the Chinese economy, and part of that will be the impact of what the next administration is going to do when it comes to China. I was feeling last night this strange whooshing sound, and it was once again the sort of air being sucked out of Washington because of a Donald Trump tweet. In this case, it was a threat to levy more tariffs on China and new tariffs, fresh tariffs on Mexico and China. But we will not, I repeat, we will not let Donald Trump hijack this panel. So we'll be talking about U.S.-China, but also about China in itself. And that way to start, I thought I'd turn to Eswar Prasad, who I've been talking to for more than a decade about China, to give us a sense of where the Chinese economy stands now. There's a lot of talk about it slowing. Are we at peak China, given that's a loaded term? After all, people have talked about peak oil for years and have been wrong about it. So Eswar, what's your thoughts on the Chinese economy?
So Bob, first of all, you're legendary, not just because you were doing China reporting for a long time, but because you were doing it so well. I think you were required reading for all of us trying to follow China and understand it. So this panel is quite topical, not just because we are at the dawn of a new administration, but also because China has been the largest contributor to global growth since the global financial crisis. And what happens to the Chinese economy has large implications, especially for emerging markets, but also many other countries around the world. And China has been beset by a combination of very adverse circumstances There are cyclical problems, structural problems, as well as long-term issues, all of which are feeding off each other. And all of this is happening against a background of concerns about the Chinese government's ability to maneuver the economy around these difficulties, and also an increasingly unfavorable and indeed hostile external environment. So on the cyclical front, after the very sharp snapback from the COVID pandemic, the economy has lost growth momentum. And in particular, what we have seen is that the attempts of the Chinese government to rebalance the economy towards boosting consumption and private investment have really had a setback in recent years. So we've seen industrial activity and various elements of domestic activity not doing terribly well. Now, of course, the structural issues have been quite long-standing, and you've written quite extensively about them, Bob. The banking sector remains quite inefficient in terms of its allocation of resources. It remains beset by a large number of issues, including, a large number of bad loans, which really don't show up easily on the books. State governments have had a squeeze on their finances, and the property sector has not been doing well. Now, the bigger concern in my mind is really the sense that there is a lack of confidence in the government's ability to move the economy around these challenges. In the pre-COVID era, when I went to China, I always got the sense from businesses and people in the private sector that I met that the economy did face challenges, but the government was up to the task. In my post-COVID trips, there's been a clear difference between the way officials in Beijing seem to view the economy and its prospects, and how private sector entrepreneurs seem to view it. I think there is a real sense that the fundamental view of the Chinese government towards the private sector has shifted. One got the strong sense that talking through entrepreneurs, that too much success was not going to be tolerated, and the private sector needed to know its place. And this has serious implications for the short term as well as the long term, because the Chinese government does need the private sector for productivity growth, which is going to be crucial as the economy deals with unfavorable demographics, and is also essential for employment growth, which the economy has not been very good at generating, even in a high growth period. So layered on top of all of this, of course, is the fact that we now have an unfavorable external environment, which becomes even more important because the deficiency of domestic demand, especially household consumption demand, has meant that much of the recent recovery has been on the production side of the economy. So there is a great deal of excess capacity that is going to need to be exported to the rest of the world if China cannot revive domestic demand. And this is already generating tensions, and certainly they're going to be intensified once Trump takes office a couple of months from now. One positive sign is that at least in the last few months, the Chinese government seems to have come to grips with the seriousness of the situation the economy faces. It has put in place some monetary and fiscal stimulus measures, and these are certainly going to help, but only at the margin. What we have not seen are the sort of measures that are really going to be necessary to restructure the banking system. Although there has been some capital infused in the banking system, we have not seen measures to really reform the center-provincial fiscal relationship, although the local governments are being given some additional revenues and space to do a little more borrowing. But I think fundamentally the problem the Chinese government faces, which is going to have implications for China and the world, is that it needs to generate not just stimulus measures that can put the economy back on track in terms of stimulating household consumption, but in terms of reviving private sector confidence that the economy can get back on the right track. So it's going to be a heavy lift for the Chinese government, and by extension, it's going to have some implications, mostly adverse for the rest of the world.
Let me just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think that we're at a moment where China's going to fall into a recession, or the much, talked about collapse of the Chinese economy, or vast slowdown in China's economy? Are we at that moment, do you think?
The Chinese government still has enough room to maneuver to get growth in the range of 4 to 5%. But as you and I know, Bob, the question is always what is the quality of that growth going to be? How durable is it going to be? So I worry a little less about the next year or two, but rather about the direction of policies that will have significant implications for the medium to long term.
Jon, you've been looking at the way the Chinese leadership looks at the economy, how Xi Jinping makes decisions. So how do you look at how the Chinese political calendar and the issues facing the leadership affect the decision making when it comes to the economy?
Great. Well, thanks for that question, Bob, and thanks for that great lay down, Eswar. And I think what's really interesting when you look at this problem set is that if you were to look at this from the perspective of Xi Jinping's inbox, the challenges that Eswar just laid out are quite daunting, right? But I think if you look at it from Xi's perspective, and you look at it, and I think you have to look at it through a political prism just to understand how they've been dealing with these issues over the past year, right? Because if you just look at the economic data alone, it doesn't really make much sense, right? And I do think there's this conception sometimes that decision-making in Beijing operates a little bit akin to our own Federal Reserve, right? Where data comes in and policy comes out. But I think from Xi's perspective, it's very politically motivated. And I think there's really three key moments that I would anchor the storyline around over the past year. I think you have to go back to about a year ago when the third plenum that is supposed to focus on economic policy for the Chinese Communist Party didn't happen and got bumped back to July. I think the other key moment came in September and in the run-up to October when the party convened a plenum. Not the plenum, sorry, the Politburo meeting where they announced some of the measures that were discussed. And that occurred right before the 75th anniversary of the PRC's founding on October 1st, which I don't think is an accident. And I think the final key moment was our own election this past month. So let me just walk folks through what's happened over the past year. So again, if you go back to about a year ago this time, there was a bit of a parlor game going on among the China watching community about when China was going to convene its third plenum. And again, I think it's worth remembering here that going back to the start and reform and opening up period, this meeting had occurred with almost metronomic regularity every 5 years. So to my mind, as a longtime China watcher, it was remarkable that that meeting didn't happen at the end of last year, but Xi did convene a foreign affairs work conference, which prior to his tenure did not occur very often. That was more of an epochal event than a regular one. And to my mind, what that indicated was that as Xi was rounding the corner from 2023 into 2024, he was much more focused on foreign affairs than economic policy per se. And I think if you just look at the political calendar, that makes a lot of sense, actually, right? Xi was looking at an election in Taiwan in January, and then, of course, our own election just earlier this month. So I think he was comfortable with delaying it, and I think my own perspective on Xi's thinking about this is a little bit of an outlier, right? I actually think that when Xi looked at the economy and the challenges facing, I actually think he felt fairly comfortable with where the economy was at. It was still growing, even though it was slowing down. But when you unpack some of the problems and you look at the sectors that were really taking a big economic hit, real estate was such a big one. And I think from the perspective of Xi Jinping, he knew that this had been a problem for such a long time, and that the previous premier, Li Keqiang, made these kind of iterative, but frankly kind of lame attempts to rein in the property sector bubble. And I think from Xi's perspective, this is not a part of the economy that he really wants to focus on, right? And I think he's cognizant of the risks of moral hazard. I think something else that is looming in Xi Jinping's mind when he looks at this set of issues is that, remember, he was the heir apparent, or had just been designated the heir apparent when the global financial crisis occurred back in 2008. And even though China weathered that crisis very well compared to other great powers, including the United States, I think he was very mindful of the criticism that China got at the time for how they handled it, which was basically flood the zone with debt and kick all your problems down the road, right? And now that I think Xi is well into his third term, he stacked the Politburo Standing Committee and the key economic decision-making bodies with his own buddies. I think he feels that he's in a sufficiently politically unassailable position that he can muscle through these problems. That yes, there's going to be a crunch time. It's going to be difficult and painful, but the Chinese economy is going to merge in a stronger position on the other side of all these problems and all these pains and difficulties. Right. And I think that's why he was comfortable with postponing the plenum until this past July. Right. I think what got Xi's attention following the plenum was not just the severity of the mounting economic data per se. Again, I think he views these problems through very much a political perspective, right? And I think what started to get his attention was not just the problems that were confounding the localities, but the fact that the localities were starting to have trouble paying their own party cadre, right? And I think at that point, the issue stops being just an economic one and starts to get to something that Xi Jinping does really care about, right? And that's how you maintain control over a communist party that's larger than the population of Germany, right? And I think that partially explains the timing of some of the measures that we saw. Now, I'm partial to the phrase that Arthur Krober's used for describing the package that we saw unveiled starting at the Politburo meeting in September and in the subsequent MPC Standing Committee meeting. That's more of a stabilization package, right, than a stimulus package per se. There was some relief provided to the localities, but a lot of it was, it seemed like it was shuffling money around and shuffling debt around, right, to give them a little bit more space to do things. And I think, again, part of the timing here and part of the story about why he did that during the September Politburo meeting and got people all excited was, again, because of the PRC's impending birthday party on October 1st, right? I don't think he wanted the storyline and the narrative to be going into that celebration that the Chinese economy was in the tank and that the stock market in particular was in rough shape. And that was the first element that you saw where people got excited, right? Was in the stock market. They had a huge rally as they went into October 1. Right. And then what we've seen subsequently in the run-up to our own election was they delayed another important meeting, and that was the National People's Congress Standing Committee meeting. And they delayed it, I think, quite obviously until after our election because they wanted to see the outcome. And I think this is another way to explain the reserved and relatively restrained approach that we've seen the PRC leadership take towards stimulus so far, is they want to make sure that there are saved rounds for the coming Trump administration, right? They want to make sure that they have additional stimulus measures that they can unveil in the new year to speed along the economy if they need to. I think what they've been leery of throughout this past year is stimulating the economy and then not having any more headroom to lean into those fiscal resources that they do have to ensure that they hit their growth targets in the coming year.
Great. Just a note here. John mentioned Arthur Krober. For those who don't know him, he's the head of a firm called Dragonomics, which does economic forecasting about China. So there's a lot of talk about doom and gloom when it comes to the Chinese economy, and a fair amount of triumphalism, I would say, in the United States that the United States is growing faster, China's on the ropes. What do you think the chances are that the kind of gloom and doom are wrong, that they'll muddle through somehow? They'll reduce the real estate bubble, they'll help the local governments, metza, but that they'll kind of get through it. What's your kind of assessment?
Thank you very much, Bob, for the question, and also thank you, Ryan and David, for inviting me. I think Professor Prasad and Jonathan earlier laid out some great point about the challenges, both internal and external, for the Chinese economy, and certainly viewing from some of the Chinese policymakers' vantage point, they try to make the argument saying that the Chinese economic difficulties this time is very much a cyclical problem rather than a long-term structural challenges. But personally, I tend to think that this is more of a structural problem rather than just the cyclical issues, right? But that being said, to what extent this merely fits into the sort of the boom and bust cycle. I personally don't think at this moment it is merely a boom bust cycle, and the challenges for a China economic stagnation is there, and in particular in terms of downward spiral towards deflationary loop. And let me take a step back by explaining, is there reasons to be optimistic if viewing from Beijing's point of view? Yes, obviously there is strong reason to be optimistic, despite the slow recovery since COVID. And one important factor is that if we take a look at the contribution of GDP growth last year, renewable energy expansion actually contribute to about 40% of GDP expansion last year. So viewing from Beijing's point of view, and if all the 5-year plans said that renewable sector is the strategic sector, this is where we're going to go, then obviously this is a triumph, and there is reasons to be triumph. Take EV, for example. Yes, it has fueled a lot of trade tensions, but last year, EV export actually grew by almost 70% compared with a year ago. And about a third of Chinese passenger car export in terms of quantity, that is, electric vehicles. So again, those are data points to be optimistic about, especially the goal is to make sure that the strategic sectors get their fair share of spotlight. But I do think that there are sort of more reasons to be cautious rather than having this kind of celebratory moment as if the Chinese economy is going to continue. Some people argue that the Chinese economy can continue growth at least 5% or even 8% for another decade. I think if we are thinking about potential, sure, but how China can reach that growth potential, at least now it's doubtful, not just in terms of debt, demographics, demand, or de-risking, decoupling. I think there are near-term challenges at people level. This fits into earlier Professor Prasad mentioned, the lack of confidence in the government's ability to deliver continued economic growth. And for individual people, this literally means that their wage growth has to not stagnate, but rather they have to be able to have a stable, not just in terms of stable job, but also stable income, and their housing prices cannot necessarily stay as low as it is. But right now, I think especially recent incidences like the mass public attack in 1 week, 3 cases in November, perhaps it is the outcry of a lot of these normal Chinese people who felt that they have no other ways to be heard given a lot of the economic pressure. And then I guess I'll just conclude by explaining why this moment is still very much fluid and why the pressure of deflationary is high. Yes, you have a lot of new sectors, but then the so-called overcapacity sectors, although Chinese colleagues may disagree, but some of these manufacturer jobs, they are, in order to find a tariff bypassing country or for whatever reasons, these companies have all the reasons to relocate outside of China. And inside of China, to address the problem of aging, you also have a lot of government attention to invest in automatics and robotics. And a lot of this means less jobs, not only for the existing population, but for the younger generation. So a lot of this does not really bode well for the labor market dynamics, or for that matter, the realization of China's growth in the long run.
Okay, great. Wendy, I asked Jon to try to explain how Xi Jinping thinks about things. I'm going to ask you a harder question. How does Donald Trump think about things? So give me your sense. I mean, it's crystal clear. It couldn't have been any more clearer than last night that Trump's going to focus on U.S.-China economic and trade relations. What do you make of what he said last night, and what do you expect going forward? What will it mean in terms of tariffs and trade wars and so on?
Okay, some easy questions. But first of all, it's just my honor to be on this panel with my colleagues. So what did we hear last night? I think one takeaway is that he's threatening higher tariffs on our friends, Canada and Mexico now than China. But second, he announced last night about, imposing a 10% additional tariff on China. But this was not for purposes dealing with trade. This had to deals with fentanyl and his view that illegal drug trafficking is taking place. So for those, when I initially heard the 10%, I'm like, wow, that's a lot less than the 60% hike he was talking about on the campaign trail. But none of us should be mistaken that this 10%, that's it. Because again, this isn't even a tariff to deal with China's huge trade imbalance, which he has, made very clear that this is top of mind. So what does this all mean? You know, when I look at China, I think China has been preparing for the second Trump term for a while. And why do I say that? I mean, if you look at efforts by China to become more self-sufficient, if you look at efforts by China to diversify its trading partners and seek trade agreements, not only did they conclude RCEP in the past few years with 14 other Indo-Pacific countries, but they also applied to join the CPTPP. They are now negotiating to join the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. They upgraded their FTA with Peru. They're importing more agriculture from Brazil and Argentina, making them less dependent on the US market. They've also implemented a legal framework, which wasn't around during the first term, giving them kind of the platforms to quickly take measures if they choose to do so, including their anti-sanctions law, the unreliable entities list, export control laws, etc. And then within the past couple of months, Jonathan's already touched on the fiscal stimulus. They've obviously announced stimulus or stabilization funds, whatever you want to call them. But I couldn't agree more that they're holding back some to see what more might be needed, depending on how disruptive Trump's actions may be on their economy. They also just last week announced a new 9-point assistance program for their exporters to help them kind of weather the storm, not only of Trump tariffs, but also, let's just put on the table, many other countries are imposing tariffs and other import restrictions against Chinese imports due to large surges of imports in the so-called overcapacity sectors. And then finally, China over the past recent years and just the past few weeks is really positioning itself to be the champion of free trade, the champion of globalization, anti-protectionism, et cetera. And so I was struck just, in the past 24 hours that China's now come to is becoming the best friend of Mexico and kind of defending Mexico now against the Trump tariffs. I can go on what actions they may take in response, but back to you, Bob, to lead the discussion.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up on that. What do you think the chances are that he doesn't go out full blast on tariffs? That he, well, let me modify that. So he talks about tariffs and all that, but really what he tries to do is enforce the phase one deal and negotiate another deal. What do you think chances are?
So I think we'll learn a lot by how high the additional tariff rate is. In other words, right now, both in just general terms, the U.S. and China's average tariff rate against each other is in the 20% range. If he then announces another 60%, and that takes tariffs, over 80%, I think that's less about negotiating and more about disentangling our economies and decoupling them. If he goes forward with low margins and maybe says over time he might increase them, I think that will be a sign of he wants to do a deal with China. But I just want to put on the table, as a former trade negotiator, I don't really know what we would negotiate with China this time around in a trade agreement, except for a managed trade agreement along the lines of China agrees to buy more from us, like the first phase agreement, but also we agree to import quotas, in terms of limiting Chinese exports to the United States. I don't see us going back to the table and trying to negotiate strength in IPR and more on technology transfer and all of that, while, there were some incremental gains for the trade war and, all of the impacts of all of the tariffs. There was frankly very little to show from the phase one agreement.
Let's switch back to Xi Jinping. John, let me ask you this question. I mean, he's clearly all in on a tech first policy. When it's very clear that China has a youth unemployment problem, an aging unemployment problem. Tech clearly if you want to be a world leader, it means a lot of automation. Why do you think he's moving in that direction, which you would think would be not all that helpful, generally speaking, to the Chinese economy.
Yeah. So my own sense of it is that it's precisely because of the demographic crunch, right? And I think part of the bet that he's making is that technology is going to be able to ameliorate some of China's problems with both with productivity and with dealing with the fact of an aging population over time, right? It does less to explain the youth unemployment problem, which I do think is probably a little bit more eye-catching for them. But again, I think that probably from his perspective, I think this is a short-term manageable problem, right? I mean, there's a very good case to be made, and I think a lot of Western economists have made that case, and I think Eswar and others have been arguing this too, that this is a big bet, but that this perhaps might not be the right trajectory to go on, right? And if you really wanted to ameliorate the economy, you should focus on demand side. But I think what's very striking is that even though that's been the consistent conventional wisdom in Washington and in the West more broadly, and from the financial sector, since the end of zero COVID, we have seen Xi Jinping been very loath to go in that direction, right? And take steps to prop up the demand side of the economy.
Zoe, what's your thoughts on this? Why go in, tech heavy?
And there are, I think investment in tech certainly fits into the productivity growth narrative. But then on the other hand, President Xi Jinping, he, as well as his predecessors, talk a lot about building China as a technology power. And this certainly fits into his self-sufficiency drive and build up China's international prestige. But I think in the shorter term, in particular, in addressing some of these structural economic challenges, perhaps viewing from his point of view, allocating more investment into the tech sector, also sort of remove money or the extra credit into the property sector that has fueled China's economic and financial instability. So from that point of view, I think are there good reasons to invest in tech? Sure, but I think perhaps at this particular moment, especially after the first Trump term, the Huawei shock really mobilized not just Xi Jinping and the Chinese policymakers, but to a certain extent, even Chinese tech companies, mobilized them to realize the risk of being overly dependent on tech suppliers from the United States. And I remember talking to a few tech startup people in Shenzhen this summer. I asked them, to what extent you are trying to get money from, or like, are American money and investors still attractive? Folks told me that, well, yes, we'd like to continue welcome them, but the problem is that we learned the lesson from Huawei, and therefore, we don't want to take their money. And it seems that the strength attached is more coming from what if you cut not just money, but also the technology. Now, I think the kind of fundamental insecurity felt at the private sector level, especially the tech startups, they realize that if I can get money from the government, I can get subsidies, probably that's a safer way to go, especially if you brand Huawei as, if you don't support Huawei, that's not patriotic. If you brand it that way, I think that makes a lot of sense to mobilize the entire country.
Eswar, what happened to the much discussed Chinese stimulus package that so excited the stock market? I mean, what were the impact of the measures? What would you expect going forward?
What was really important, in my view, Bob, was the sense that after a period when the government did not seem to be, coming to grips with the risks the economy faced in terms of growth, in terms of deflation becoming entrenched and so on, finally the government seemed to be coming alive, so to speak, with its policy measures. We saw a barrage of monetary policy actions first, including cuts in interest rates, measures to make credit more easily available. And those are certainly good, but not very effective at stimulating household consumption or private business investment at a time when confidence is the problem. Making money more easily available and making it available more cheaply does not really incentivize households to go out and consume or private businesses to invest. Fiscal policy tends to be a little more effective in those circumstances, and I think we have seen some significant measures. Now, I think as Jon pointed out, what these measures amount to so far are measures to deal with some structural issues, the very powerless state of local government finances, which have been hit by the property sector, downtown, and other structural issues. And also the fact that the banking system certainly needs an infusion of capital. So it's good that we've seen measures on that on those fronts. Now, I think all of our colleagues, Jon, Zoe, and Wendy, have pointed out that the government is also trying to accomplish some longer-term objectives, and it seems to be trying to direct fiscal policy in a way that tries to meld both the short-term and long-term objectives. But I think we're going to need to see some slightly more targeted fiscal policy measures, and maybe they're just holding firepower in reserve, given what we all knew was coming, which was the Trump tariff shock, which we are beginning to see the initial indications of. But in addition to those measures, I think we are really going to need to see a broader package of confidence-building measures. Now, China is a big, complicated economy, and once upon a time I used to argue that substantial reforms were needed, but I've come to the view that in an economy beset with so many inefficiencies, you can't have big change overnight. But what I think markets are looking for, investors and both domestic and foreign, and households and private businesses in China are looking for, is a sense that the government is willing to undertake some of the important structural reforms, to the financial markets, to the fiscal system, its orientation towards private enterprise, that are really needed to set the ship in the right direction. And while no huge, changes can be expected overnight, at least some down payment in terms of some small steps in these directions could really increase the effectiveness of any stimulus measures that they undertake. Because I think at this stage, stimulus by itself, even if we see more fiscal stimulus, is not going to cut it. It's going to take a bit more.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic that they will make those down payments on the structural changes?
What I see that is a little disconcerting is a sense that there is a degree of policy, well, maybe paralysis is too strong a word, but there is a sense of extreme conservatism in political circles right now, because there have been a number of steps taken by Xi Jinping in now what looks like an extended term of office, and possibly an indefinite one, to centralize power. I think a number of bureaucrats and people in the private sector have gotten caught up in the anti-corruption issues, which again might be well-intended, but have certainly had a chilling effect in terms of both the private sector and in terms of the risks that government officials take. So I think the overall policy-making environment doesn't quite seem to be up to the task of moving in a flexible way. We saw this with the way the COVID policy was handled. The zero lockdown policy, in my view, was held far beyond any length for which it was tenable. And then it was abruptly reversed in a way that caused some complications when it was coming off, and I think had some fairly negative consequences. So I think the sense that there can be good continuity to policy making, and that there is a set of officials who are willing to take the risks necessary to push the economy in the right direction, I don't quite see that. So there is a fair bit, I think, to worry about.
Jon, do you think it's conservatism on the part of the Chinese leaders, or self-satisfaction that they think they know what they're doing, and the critics are wrong?
Yeah, I think it's probably the latter, right? Because as we discussed earlier, I mean, they do have the wherewithal and the resources to take a different direction if they so choose, right? And I do think there's a degree of comfort, even if it's misguided, that they are on the right trajectory. And I think it's telling too, I mean, especially given the way the political system operates in China, right? The fact that they did have the third plenum in July, I think that basically laid out the parameters for what we could see for the next year or two, because that is the definitive authoritative document, right? So that kind of sets your left and right boundaries. So I think what we saw at the Politburo meeting, and then at the MPC Standing Committee meeting, I think people got a little bit overexcited about what might be coming down the pike, right? But I don't think they were going to go beyond that, especially given how closely sequenced those meetings were, right? From July to September, there was nothing so dramatic for them to fundamentally shift course, right? I think they did some things to stabilize, they did some things around the margins, right? But I think from their perspective, they, having delayed the meeting, right, and then codified it in the communique from and the decision from the third plenum, I think that set the outer boundaries really of what they can do going forward. The last thought that I would share too is that I think my strong suspicion is there's probably a little bit of a difference in perspective from the top political leadership, right? From the Xi Jinping Politburo Standing Committee level and people further down in the system. You know, my sense is that, as others indicated, right, there is a fair bit of anxiety among, you know, not just the private sectors, but I think lower level officials, right? I assume that many of the U.S. side's counterparts at maybe the vice ministerial level or the DG level are experiencing quite a bit of anxiety right now and really sweating out the trajectory that they're on. Over.
Zoe, it sounds like you agree with the latter. What about that whole idea that is there a division between the more junior members of the government and party and the more senior members, as far as you can tell?
As far as I can tell, I do think within China and even within one particular government institution or one think tank, there are diverse opinions, but it matters. And it puzzles me and perhaps a lot of China watchers, you know, how the individual opinion eventually gets selected and pushed up to the Xi Jinping's secretary office and eventually being sent up. In a recent conversation, I think I learned a little bit, and that sort of helped me understand why there seems to be major policy swings since President Xi Jinping came to power. For a long period of time, he talked a lot about a common prosperity, and it seems now that that slogan becomes a slogan again. And it seems that there was a lot of talking about the 3 red lines in the property market, and now we swing back, encouraging Chinese families to buy not just one house, but, you know, like more 2 or 3 houses. So the idea, I feel like, you know, first of all, I think it is very important for me to realize that perhaps this major policy swing goes to show he doesn't really have or at the top leadership level, he, as well as, you know, he surrounded himself by the so-called yes man. There is no coherent marching direction. There is no vision in terms of where we wanted the economy to march towards. And as a result, you end up having, let's try what might work. So the first set of policy measures is one that sort of fits in the vision of China is the great power, the east wind prevails over the west wind, and the United States probably is in decline. And you tried that for 1 year or 1 year and a half, realizing that that's not necessarily is working. So now you started to swing back, try a different set of policies. I feel like there is lack of coherent vision, and I think that is probably a problem. And the over trying to if they are making the bet saying that the U.S. is in decline, whereas China is having the upper hand, I think that is a fundamental mistake if that's what they are banking on.
Wendy, you were, excuse me, got a bit of a cold. Wendy, you were talking about the various efforts by the Chinese to cut trade deals, a variety of trade deals in Asia and with the global South. I wondered, and also the irony of irony, even joining what used to be called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a U.S. effort basically to freeze out the Chinese and pressure them by an alliance with other countries in the region. How successful do you think a strategy that could be? I mean, can you actually replace, you know, a loss of trade with the United States?
Well, you know, look, it's a strategy, and like all strategies, they're having mixed results. Clearly, they are making inroads, and I would say the RCEP agreement, for example, is a strong indication of further integration of the economies in Asia. The CPTPP, their bid is now 3 years old, and the CPTPP members are meeting this week in Canada for their annual ministerial meeting. And I think there's like zero chance that they're going to announce that, you know, they've accepted China's application to start negotiations. But again, mixed results. I think in the digital space and the DEPA, they're getting closer to joining. And again, they're upgrading their FTAs. Also, I think what's interesting and a tool that they may use is giving more benefits, not just through trade agreements, but just generally to foreign businesses, maybe with the exception of US businesses, in order, like they follow an affirmative action, and by definition, US companies have less access and are in a disadvantaged position. So for example, just last week, China announced further easing of visa requirements for a whole host of countries, including Japan. And so I think they are making efforts and looking at ways to kind of not just drive wedges between all these countries, but also to get closer to them, give them more benefits. And I think that's a way to disadvantage the United States.
Do you see any evidence that they'll make a gesture to the United States to try to hold off Trump? Crack down on fentanyl, buy more soybeans, I don't know, a variety of things.
Look, I'm sure someone in Beijing, as well as in world capitals all over the world, are coming up with those plans, like how they can, head off tariffs. Whether they ever see the light of day, we don't know. I'm fairly confident that China, is very ready to retaliate against the United States, even with its weak economy. Maybe it is less levers and it needs to be, more careful this time, but they have a whole host of tools, and I don't think they're going to be reluctant to use them and to, and show that, that two can play at this game.
It's interesting. But the last time, what's the example we have? The trade war that they had under Trump the last time, that clearly they matched them tariff for tariff, without a doubt. But there were so many more things they could have done. I kept thinking all they needed to do was slow iPhone deliveries during Christmas. That in itself would have been just an enormous, hit to the American economy. But they didn't do any of it. They didn't do anything. And I think it was their concern about losing foreign direct investment. That if you hurt Apple, and you're Samsung, would you think, oh, this is great, we have a competitive advantage, or would you think, oh, we're next? I wonder if you think, John, let me move this to you. Do you think that dynamic still plays in, or do you think it's just different this time, and they'll be more likely to actually follow through on the many things they could do to disadvantage the United States?
Thanks, Bob. It's a great question. I think it's the $1 trillion question, right? What's going to be their appetite for risk on this go around, right? Because I was struck by the same thing in the last trade war, right? They did enough just to retaliate and signal their peak, right? But they didn't really undertake actions that would have led to further escalation, right? They seem very well calibrated in that way, right? And I think that approach and that posture has actually held through the Biden administration as well, right? With the various measures that the Biden administration has undertaken. Like, I think if you go back 2 years ago to the first round of major export controls, right, on chips in October 2022, the reaction was fairly muted, right? I think Wendy's point is very well taken, though, that they have put in place a number of options, right? And they haven't pulled the trigger yet, right? Like on germanium and on gallium, right? These various export control measures, they've laid the predicate down, but they have not implemented these measures yet, right? And that in and of itself has been a signal so far. I think as I try to two thoughts. Number one, it seems clear just from talking to Chinese interlocutors that it seems like China is not going to want to make the first move in this engagement, right? They're not. They seem reluctant, at least initially, to try to take measures to assuage the Trump administration, right, and get off the X, right? What I've heard from Chinese friends so far, and these are more kind of think tank academic sites, is that they're going to wait for the U.S. to make the first move, and then they'll calibrate in response, right? Which seems to kind of fit with their modus operandi in handling these issues, right? I think there's also a political upside for them diplomatically in dealing with the global South and others, right? It gives them the moral high road because then they look like the victim, right? And then it justifies whatever it is that they're going to do in response to this. But I think what's really changed when I think about, comparing trade war 1.0 and then a potential trade war 2.0, and this perhaps just reflects my own bias, is Xi's political position at home, right? When the first trade war happened, Xi was still in the process of moving the system toward strongman rule, right? It was in the midst of all this that he rolled back the term limits on the presidency and was really consolidating his own position. So he was at the front end of his second term. Now he's well into his third term in office, right? And he's in a much different political position at home, right? And I think on the one hand, that potentially gives him the flexibility to take a more accommodating approach, right? And to try to mollify Washington if he thinks that's going to be an effective posture, right? Because I don't think he's at this point in his tenure, nobody's going to give him a hard time for being insufficiently tough with the United States, right? Nobody's going to stand up and criticize him. That's an unwise career move at this point in the political system, right? So that's one way this could all play out. But on the other hand, if you try to get into his headspace, he is in his third term. He's, larger and in charger at this point in his tenure. And does he really have the patience for this go around, right? And I think, as Wendy indicated earlier, part of the reason why they might let the U.S. go first is precisely because of that, right? If this looks like it's the opening round of a conversation and an engagement, then I think Xi takes a course where he tries to mollify us. And I increasingly think what he'll do is kind of like what seemed to happen in Trade War 1.0, based on reading your book, Bob. It's a rope-a-dope strategy, right? Drag out the negotiations until Trump starts to feel the political pressure of having some kind of win going into the midterms, right? I think that's one potential way he plays it. But if it looks like it's going to be a more draconian set of measures, and it looks like this is a strategy that is aimed more at decoupling rather than having some kind of protracted trade discussion, then I think we're playing a different game. And I would suspect that he would resort to those sharp, painful trade retaliation measures that Wendy talked about earlier more quickly.
I mean, what I noted with the Biden administration, as I kept expecting the Chinese to make, offer some olive branches and so on, make some move. I mean, they finally gotten rid of Trump. They didn't, and I think from both capitals, it was waiting for the other guy to make the move first, and that kind of started things off in a less advantageous way. I mean, so I wonder what you think about how the export controls so far. I mean, how have they affected China's tech plans? Do you think the U.S. has actually hurt or slowed down China's economic development, or they've been less effective than advertised?
And I think there are two dimensions. One is in the short term versus long term, and then the other dimension is in the U.S. leverage. I do think that it slowed down China's and increased the cost and forced the Chinese government to make a costly prioritization decisions. Are you going to double down tech investment, or are you going to have more money allocated to beef up the social security network? So I do think that that's one choice that has been obvious, that the government has the Chinese government made more investment in tech, specifically in response perhaps to the export controls. And then on the other hand, this in the long run, I do think that probably this is going to reduce the U.S. leverage over China in the long run, assuming that given the nature of technology is diffusion, and one way or another over time, assuming that China can develop its own type of standard, its own type of operating system, or even an entire ecosystem for apps or for infrastructure communication, or even space competition with the United States. So I think that is a concern. But then on the other hand, I do think that China is learning from the U.S. playbook in terms of export controls, and here in terms of critical mineral probably is a very, very important example. And given that both Japan, European Union, and both have encoded in their economic security strategy of developing their own critical mineral supply chain, and the Biden administration also established the mineral security partnership. From long-term perspective, perhaps Beijing realized that its leverage over the West in terms of critical minerals is going to diminish. So I am afraid that probably the willingness to use export controls in terms of critical minerals in the coming new trade war probably is going to be higher than before, specifically because the diminished return in the long run.
Eswar, what do you think? Let's do some wargaming, I suppose. Let's assume here that there is a really serious trade war between the U.S. and China, that China actually retaliates. I mean, a significant trade war that has significant economic costs to both the U.S. and China. What do you think the odds are? And I know that it's not the majority view, to say the least. What do you think the odds are that a serious trade war actually spurs China to make the reforms that you and many other economists inside China and outside China have been urging for many years?
That would be a positive outcome, perhaps for China and maybe for the rest of the world as well. I do want to pick up on a point that Jon made about the political context in China having shifted. It's also shifted in the US, and the economic context has shifted in a very important way as well. As we all suspect, there are going to be fewer restraints on Trump in a second term. And yes, there are going to be midterms looming sooner than we think, but it's clear that Trump's political support seems to be increased if he takes very aggressive actions against China on issues such as immigration and so forth. So I think we will see a much more hostile Trump on issues related to China. And the economic context is hugely different. Unlike in the first Trump presidency, the US economy is on the upswing, the Chinese economy is not doing so well, and China in the last couple of years has relied quite heavily on exports, and much of the rest of the world that China would like to export to pick up on Wendy's point, is not doing very well. Europe is not in great shape, neither is Japan, nor are many other major export markets of China. So Germany is trying to find ways to deflect Chinese exports. So this is a very, very different scenario in terms of the relative economic power between the two countries. But in terms of the broader issues, and this touches on something that Zoe alluded to, China does want to move up the value-added chain, wants to become technologically more self-sufficient, but it's not quite there yet. And I think what we saw was very effective in the Biden administration's approach to China was that restricting technology transfers, restricting access to chips really hurts China, both in terms of its short-term growth and in terms of its longer-term industrial restructuring. So I think the gloves are really coming off at this stage, and I don't see an easy way to de-escalate this now. China can certainly try to go back to its playbook of, proportionate reactions, try to do other things that mollify Trump. But I think the Trump team has probably learned the lessons from the last time that Trump was able to declare victory, as you wrote, Bob, in your book and elsewhere about, more soybean purchases and so on, most of which were never fulfilled. So I think the Trump team is going to take a much harder tack this time. So I think some rough times are ahead.
I mean, I think the biggest restraint on Trump, it was last time, was certainly the markets. And this election. This time, presumably, well, this time he won't be up for re-election. But the markets are significant. It's the way he judges himself. The market, the stock market going up and down. I wonder also, given that China will probably try to peel off Europe from the United States when it comes to trade. How much do you think Chinese growth depends on the settling of the Russia-Ukraine war, in the sense that that's the biggest disagreement, I would say, between Europe and between the EU and Beijing. Jon, what do you think? Do you think there's a spillover from that military question to the economic?
Yeah, I think from Beijing's perspective, and they might be wrong about this and underestimating the dynamic, but I think from their perspective, they've already managed the tensions with Europe, at least vis-a-vis China's own support for Russia, fairly effectively. Right? And I think we saw that manifested earlier this year, right, where Xi Jinping went to Europe for the first time in a while, right, and he had a series of engagements with Macron and others, right, and the European delegations that visited China were accompanied by large business delegations, right? And I think that made China feel better about its position, right? That it's able to have it both ways. It's not really balancing. It seems pretty clearly intent on deepening this relationship with Russia, not just in the context of the Ukraine war, but I think for the long term, right? And I think that entente between the two, it's much deeper and much bigger than the war in Ukraine. I think from my perspective, it really goes back to the start of Xi Jinping's tenure when he made his first state visit to Russia right after becoming general secretary, right? This has been an accelerant, clearly. So I don't think that dynamic is going to change. But I think that there is a real risk that China can and might be able to have it both ways by having both the entente with Russia, and if this war comes to some kind of conclusion and they're not getting beaten up about this diplomatically, episodically, that there is space for them to drive a wedge between the United States and its European allies.
All right.
If I
Thanks.
could,
Sure,
just
please.
one point, I think it's important to watch progress made in the current negotiations between China and the EU on electric vehicles. Those negotiations have been going on for a while. My understanding, for a long time, they weren't going anywhere. And just recently, I'm hearing that there seems to be maybe, some potential for a deal. And so I think that will send an important signal either way, on whether Europe and China can find a way to work together going forward, particularly, in a world where Trump becomes president in a couple of months.
All right. I think we're gonna have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to everyone, Jon, Zoe, Wendy, Eswar, for a great conversation, and there'll be a lot more of these sort of conversations going on over the next 4 years and beyond. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.